Hello and welcome to this latest edition of the Business Post podcast with me, Danny McConnell.
And me, Peter O'Dwyer.
Peter, it's almost like, Daniel stepping into the lion's den here. We've, one of the country's most prominent trade union leaders, has dared enter into kind of Business Post HQ here in the IMI to give us his, I suppose, perspective not only on the world of work as you described it in the interview with him, but I suppose I think the main focus of the interview is the sort of the mounting tensions between themselves and government over the next round of public sector pay talks. Mm-hmm. I listened to it. Fascinating interview from that perspective. Kevin Callinan, you might just, I suppose, for the listener and for the viewer, who is he, and what was your impression of what he had to say?
Yeah, so Kevin Callinan is the General Secretary of Fórsa, which is the major unions in the country. He's also the chair of the Public Services Committee at ICTU, and he's also the lead negotiator on the public pay talks, which is kind of why he's really topical and really in the news at the moment. He's a long-time trade unionist. I mean, he's been around. He was in health unions for a long time. He would have been part of...
One-time assistant librarian.
Yes, one-time assistant librarian, as I found out, and still an avid reader, as you'll hear in the interview. But he would have been around at the time, as we touch on the interview, with Haddington Road and Croke Park and all of those difficult discussions.
He's plenty of miles under the belt.
Yeah, lots of experience. So he led the public pay talks the last time round as well, a couple of years ago. So this isn't his first rodeo. And now, as we said there, they're heading back into the talks. They actually aren't really, because it seems to be a bit stalled. They've had these preliminary talks. The dance is on, basically.
Touching of gloves, all that kind of stuff, yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. And you asked him early enough on, I think, based off a profile, I think, that was done of him when he took the job. Yeah. Of something being a kind of a ruthless pragmatist. And I'm not sure if it stung, but he certainly accepted the pragmatist element of it. Yeah. I'm not sure if the stubborn element kind of landed as nicely.
I think he kind of talked himself around to the stubborn bit, and you could see why both of those, both being stubborn and being a pragmatist, they might be the two core values that you need in a trade union negotiator. And even with ruthless, he said, to lead a union, a big union, you have to be ruthless. And you have to be, I think he meant it really in the sense of you have to be kind of laser focused. You have to keep the main thing. And I think,
there's definitely a steeliness to him. You could, that just emanated from...
There has to be, doesn't there? To get that to that level, to be the person entrusted with negotiating on however many workers in the country, public sector workers, it's a big task, so you would have to have a bit of steel about you.
You asked him the question, and I thought it was interesting to get his response, but the state of the trade union movement in Ireland, that was interesting how he just described it, said kind of numbers are up, but in the terms of the space of the overall workforce, which itself has increased massively, the imprint has sort of declined.
It's fallen quite a bit. The survey that I looked at, the Working in Ireland survey, put union representation at about the level it was a century ago. So, it hit its peak somewhere in the middle of those two endpoints, basically. Yeah. That density that he described it as, basically the proportion of workers, fell from 32%, I think, in 2021 down to 25%. They're quite big, chunky blocks for 5-year periods. It painted a picture of an ageing membership. In some, I don't think we even got to it in the interview, some of the newer sectors, like ICT, it was said to be around 7% coverage,
Okay.
Which paints a picture of not a particularly healthy movement. And in the context of such acute cost of living issues over the last while, it raises the question if that hasn't spurred a huge uptick in membership or proportion of the workforce. What will?
I wrote a lot at the time, and I covered both Croke Park and Haddington Road quite closely. And you could see the vestiges of old school trade unionism come to the fore, in terms of this sort of collective bargaining, the kind of the sort of cutthroat, and I don't necessarily mean that in a pejorative sense, but the cutthroat demands around restoring of pay, in terms of that they stood up when was counted in terms of the cuts that they took during the financial crash. But by God, they got their pound of flesh back and then some, much to, I think, to the envy of many private sector workers who have never had that sort of benefit. You asked him a very interesting question. Listeners will hear it, about the sort of, are they good at selling their message? Are they good at actually trumpeting the value of unionship? And he kind of seemed to accept the point that they could always be better at doing that.
Yeah, he references that when they communicate with their existing members, they have very high engagement, whether it be emails or however they communicate. That speaks to a very committed existing membership. But I do wonder about, are they effectively communicating the benefits of union membership? And as you've just outlined, can be real benefits of union membership, and like they are effective at getting stuff done. Even when we talk about the public pay stuff. I mean, on the one hand, of course, it's absolutely reasonable that pay increases would outstrip inflation. Kind of, what's the point otherwise? But I put it to him that, to have a guarantee that it's going to always beat inflation is quite a nice place to be. They were able to deliver it pretty much.
The cost implications of that from a state perspective are massive.
That's the balancing act, yeah.
And I also think as well that, the idea of, they know the government, and certainly any government that I've covered, they have literally zero appetite for industrial unrest. They do not want these unions out on the street. They don't want industrial action. Now, we've obviously seen strikes happen from times, but like successive governments, I should say, have set their face against the idea of industrial unrest. They liked the idea of social partnership when it worked until it kind of ran away with itself. But they have, like, Croke Park. I remember, like, Croke Park was so controversial because it was guaranteeing a level of pay to people at a time of financial ruin for this country. I remember it being in the Sunday Independent at the time. Like, it was like absolutely anathema to the kind of thinking that you would guarantee this protected cohort of people when the rest of us in the private sector were sort of kind of, at the mercy of the market and at the mercy of the external forces. But I just wonder, do they know going into these talks, or whenever the talks because they ultimately will start proper, do they know that the big weapon they have is industrial peace, or the desire for industrial peace?
Well, I think so, and we spoke about it. If I were on the government side of the fence at the moment with European presidency, with the kind of, I think, inevitable trouble that's going to be stored up with the fuel protest deal, there seems to be a lot of factors that, if I were on the government benches, I'd really want industrial peace at the moment. And you don't get that sense of an urgency from their side. Now, there's always that bit of as we say, the dance. You don't want to look too keen to get into the room, but it does seem a little more lax than I would have thought from the government side.
Well, particularly as you mentioned in the interview, that the last deal has already now lapsed. We're now in a place where we don't actually have a public sector pay deal. So there is that uncertainty hanging in the background. And I mean, as listeners again and viewers will see, Kevin talks about what are the logical next steps, like, as they're ramping up, to kind of the idea of balloting and all that kind of stuff. So we'll get into it now in the interview, but that's probably enough for us for now. But Kevin Callinan's interview with Peter is now, and we'll be back for the post-match analysis after that. Stay tuned.
Kevin Callinan, General Secretary of the Fórsa Trade Union and Chair of the Public Services Committee at ICTU. Welcome to the Business Post podcast.
Good to be here.
So we've a lot to get through: the future of work, public sector pay talks, lots of big meaty topics. But just to rewind a little bit to begin with, I saw when I was researching, your first job was a library assistant. Is that right?
Correct. Well, not quite my first job. I actually spent a year, would you believe, working as a copy boy in the Irish press.
Oh, right. Very good.
Yeah.
You almost went down this cursed route.
Almost. Very different industry at the time.
Yeah.
Incredible when you look at the scale of the changes that affected the industry, and I suppose a good example of, how much work can change.
I take it you're an avid reader. What is your favourite, or what's the most important book you've ever read? Anything that informs your worldview? Any early reading that set you on a certain track?
Nothing in particular comes to mind. I suppose, like a lot of people, The Ragged-Trousered Philanthropist was a bit of a one that you remember, but kind of, to be honest, what I prefer to read, when I have the time on holiday is, novels and, a lot of the kind of the Ian McEwans and people like that, who I read.
More of an escape.
Escape, exactly. Yeah.
Okay. Again, when I was just doing a bit of research, I saw the last time the public sector pay talks were around back in 2022, the Irish Times profiled you, described you as a stubborn pragmatist, and somebody had said that you had a bit of a ruthless streak. Would you get on board with all of the above?
I think I'm a pragmatist. Maybe, I don't know who said I was stubborn. Perhaps, that's a fair comment. Look, I think to do the job I'm in, to be a general secretary of a trade union, you have to be a bit ruthless. You have to be focused. I hope people would see that I'm kind of fair, and if I'm a pragmatist, that I'm a negotiator who can kind of see both sides.
Mm-hmm. Has the nature of your own work changed over? I mean, obviously your position has changed, but talking about the evolution of work in general, has the work of a trade unionist changed significantly over your time?
There's a lot of changes in the nature of trade unions and trade union membership. And one of the things that I've been trying to do, in fact, I said it kind of when I was taking on the role of general secretary, is I've been trying to drive a lot of internal organizational change. And we've invested hugely, for instance, in data. So Fórsa now has, we celebrated at our conference in May, crossing the 100,000 member mark, but we have between 96 and 97% email coverage. We communicate with our members very regularly. We have huge open rates, which says something about kind of a level of trust that exists between our members and ourselves. That's one of the ways that we've been, changing and trying to bring new functions into play. Of course, the context for trade unions and employers has changed over my career. We've obviously had the enactment of the 1990 Industrial Relations Act, and lots of obviously, employment law changes, over the years as well.
So, I mean, picking up on what you say there, that suggests quite a committed membership of those you have. But are unions at the moment in Ireland, are they weaker than they would have been 20, 30 years ago?
I think there's no doubt, and we see it from actually the latest report on Union Voice compiled, by John Geary as the lead author of that report. We can see the continued decline in union density. So on the one hand, union membership is holding up, but as employment has grown, union density has fallen. But I still think that we have, an authoritative voice for workers generally. And I think people, whether they're union members or not, whether they're in organised employment or not, still look to unions, for leadership on issues that affect workers and the workplace. And we're seeing that in the responses in that report, but, from people who are not union members in unorganised workplaces, the level of support there is for the idea of a trade union. So I think one of the things that has struck me, very hard to put hard evidence on this, but over the course of the last 5 years or so, as the cost of living crisis has bitten, and we've been in the public eye as, negotiators, or in my case, the lead negotiator for public service pay, you do get a sense that the broader public, other than public servants, are, looking in and saying, well, hold on a minute, if public servants get a fair deal in relation to pay, there's a better chance that I, in my employment, will benefit as well, because whether it sets a benchmark, as I think it has done to an extent, or just getting the issue out there on the table.
I mean, as you said, density is falling. It's an aging membership. Even I was looking at the Working in Ireland survey that the Nevin Institute did recently. And unsurprisingly, it's the younger cohort who are most supportive. But even that fell, that it was 66% were supportive of unions in 21 down to 55%. It's quite a big drop in a short period of time. So does it suggest that the union movement is struggling to translate that into actual membership? Do you see that being a continuing trend over the next 5-10 years?
I think there's contradictory kind of evidence around that, because in the latest Union Voice report, the strongest support for union membership comes actually from the very youngest cohort of workers. I mean, it depends on how we look at things. We approach it in a particular way in this country where, union membership is associated with people who pay union subscriptions. In other countries, like in France, union membership is very low, but unions are strong, So, there are different ways we can look at it. I think the question is more, do people value the role that trade unions play in society? We're still by far and away the largest civil society organization. So on the island, approaching 800,000 members, very uniquely in this country, a single trade union federation crossing two jurisdictions, whereas most European countries, certainly modern European countries, would have a number of federations, often, based on religious or, political lines, whereas the trade union movement in this country has actually played a huge role, on the island. And when you think about, what's lying ahead in terms of the challenges that we face, I said this in my response to the Taoiseach when he came to our conference in May, we have to think more in terms of the whole island. I paid tribute to his initiative around the shared island unit, because I do think that that's the way we need to go. And the trade union movement as a single federation on the whole island, cross-community in the north, has still got a major contribution to make, I think.
Do unions and union leaders do a good enough job of communicating the benefits of unions, do you think?
I think we could, like everything else, I think we can do better. Certainly something within Fórsa that we're looking at all the time. In fact, just this morning I was talking to a colleague about, a range of the benefits that we provide, and we don't market them well enough. Something that possibly even a lot of our members don't realize now, that we have a scheme whereby a member who develops a critical illness can apply and get a €5,000 payment. It's a big investment for the union, but lots of people have benefited from that over the last 8 years. But we probably don't promote it and market it enough. And I think it's the kind of thing that, just that payment, if you're hit by that kind of crisis, just alleviate a little bit of the pressure makes a big difference. That's just one example.
Is there a thought, obviously you're on a podcast here with a media company, so there obviously is some thought about how you communicate with people, especially at important times like this. But you think of somebody like Mick Lynch in the UK in recent years, like he really cut through, people really resonated with what he was saying. He's obviously a very effective communicator. Did that kind of spur any thought within the Irish union movement of, he's saying much the same things as we would say, yet he's really cutting through, even in Ireland, outside of his own jurisdiction. How can we, as you say, better sell what we have to offer members?
Well, I think, look, that's down to style and ability as a communicator.
Yeah.
I think you're right to kind of highlight him as an example. He's been particularly effective in Britain, but also, admired here as well in just getting the simple message across. I'd like to think, in the last few years, part of what we've been saying in relation to the cost of living crisis mirrors that. And maybe that's why I think there has been more of an understanding and receptiveness among the wider population of what we're trying to do, because people will see, look, you're just trying to protect living standards. That's a reasonable case. And, if they can get it as public servants, well, then there's a better chance that, I'm also going to get it if I'm a private sector employee.
Membership is obviously, and growth or otherwise in membership is obviously a reaction to the conditions of the day. And as you mentioned, there has been cost of living crises over the last number of years. But also it's a reaction presumably to the political sphere at the time. Without kind of being too flippant or simplistic, does it serve to have a kind of Maggie Thatcher type person every now and then that maybe reminds people of the value of unions?
I'm not sure, because, if you look at the experience in Britain, a lot of legislation enacted under the Thatcher era, the trade union movement had to respond to that. I'm not sure, by comparison, whether they've done much better than we have over the period. I mean, look, the situation in Ireland has been marked by just the scale of the crises that befell the country in the 2008-2009 period. And it wasn't just a financial crash. It was, multifaceted crisis. And, for public servants who experienced, in effect, through two legislative acts, cuts averaging 14% in pay or take-home pay, then that, I think, was, a pretty phenomenal hit for them. Obviously, we saw, huge loss of jobs, across the economy as well over those years. And, the following period has been marked by the response to that. And I think one of the points that I've been trying to make is, unfortunately, that hangover, if you like, is still there. And we have an approach that's been taken at the moment that's completely inappropriate to the economic conditions that prevail, heavily influenced by what happened in 2009. We have a Department of Public Expenditure set up under the legislation that, followed the crash with extraordinary powers. And it's not just, a point in relation to public service pay. This is a wider point. I mean, I think that's inhibiting, the ability of the country to respond to the challenges that it faces. One of the things that, really struck me when I became a member of the National Competitiveness, what's now the National Competitiveness and Productivity Council in 2015, where there were two trade union places on the body that was really a vestige of social partnership. And this was, very much the captains of industry around the table, with about 10 government departments represented, with very senior officials, usually on assistant secretary level. But right from the start of my time on that, there was absolutely common case around the table about the kind of challenges that we faced in relation to infrastructure, particularly housing, childcare, education and training, and the other kind of, hard infrastructural issues that we were facing. And it was like nobody in government was listening. There was a decade wasted after that. And it's good to see that since the end of last year, we now have an infrastructural plan, and some of these issues are being tackled. But from our polling of our own members, and what we see generally, housing is still a huge concern, not just for the people who don't have houses, but for everybody, whether it's parents who have adult children living at home or just fearful of what the future holds for their children and grandchildren. And it just seems to me that we're still operating under the fear of what happened in 2009. Of course, we have to be mindful of mistakes that were made in the past by lots of people, but we have to get beyond that and really, to face up to challenges like the housing challenge. Access to healthcare is also a big thing that comes through in our polling of our own members. And I think it's also the kind of issue across the economy. So the big things are cost of living, housing, healthcare. They're the main issues of concern.
Yeah. Do you link that blockage to the Department of Public Expenditure? Is that what you're saying, that the creation of that department at the time has been a blockage in some of that infrastructure progress?
I think the situation is that they have so much power and control that you can't expect the people who are working there to be turkeys vote for Christmas. But it hasn't been addressed. It kind of was brought home to me a few years ago at a meeting at the Labour Employer Economic Forum. I can't remember what it was that we were talking about, but it was the Taoiseach of the day on the other side of the table looked along the line on his side and said, "Oh yeah, but public expenditure have a problem with that." And you're left kind of thinking, well, you're the government.
If you're not in charge, yeah.
And I think that that's something that really needs to be looked at again. I'll give you another example. People may forget this, but prior to the last public service pay talks getting underway in December of 2023, we had made the point, that the relevant section of the second Financial Emergency Measures in the Public Interest Act needed to be repealed. And there was quite a standoff for a few weeks in relation to this. You may remember. And eventually Pascal Donoghue accepted and agreed that it would be done, and it cleared the way for the talks to commence. It's nearly 3 years later. Look, I have no response to the letter to the minister. I used to write to Pascal when he was minister. I wrote to Jack Chambers when he became minister. They don't raise it at meetings. I've given up on it.
Does it? You've given up. I was going to ask. Does it just go unanswered? You're getting a wall of silence in response.
We know, because we kind of read it in the media, that there was some briefing to cabinet a few months ago, but we don't know what happened. So we have to kind of assume whatever the plan is, it's unlikely to meet with our pleasure. But the point I'm making is, like, there's an arrogance that goes with that approach, which affects the trust that needs to exist between actors in this dynamic. So when we kind of hear urgings from the minister and other government colleagues to get into a talks process, what we're saying in response to that is, look, can we have a kind of clear idea as to where we're going in relation to this in the first place, so that, we can deal with the fact that actually there is a bit of a breakdown in trust here. Are we on the same page? What we don't want is a repeat of kind of previous experiences where we've entered into a long, drawn-out process, often at the Workplace Relations Commission, and at the end of that, having, hammered out texts on all sorts of issues, the other side come in and decide, they put an offer on the table, which really is what they've already kind of predetermined that they're going to spend.
It doesn't seem like a good basis upon which to start negotiations. Like, is this a more strained beginning than in previous iterations of these talks?
It is, and I think it's been misread in parts of the media, and certainly on the government side, as just, as I think Pat Leahy has described it as, the preliminary dance before talks. This is more fundamental. And we've, in one way or another, we've had public service pay agreements either as part of a broader economy-wide agreement in the social partnership era, or in the public service agreements that have, started with the Croke Park Agreement in 2010. We've had a public service pay agreement. And that gives the government industrial peace, it gives cost certainty, and it gives cooperation on a whole wide range of issues. And it seems to us that is in many ways just been taken for granted. We don't have to have a public service agreement of that type. Obviously, if we don't, then we are going to have battles around a pay round. We are going to have battles around a whole plethora of grade claims, and we're going to have potentially battlegrounds around every issue that comes up in a workplace, or more broadly on, topics like AI, for example. Now, these are things that clearly are better addressed if we have a consensus.
So what's the impediment at the moment? So there's been these informal exploratory talks. It kind of went nowhere. There's no basis to start proper talks is kind of where we are. So what is the impediment? Is it a sequencing thing that the unions want to deal with pay up front, government wants to deal with other issues up front? Because if so, that seems like a relatively minor issue that should be ironed out pretty quickly.
Well, you might have thought so, but what we've said to them, we met them twice. We met them the night that Minister Chambers briefed the cabinet, and we met 2 days later. And in those meetings, what we said to them well, certainly the first day we said, look, we're in a time of extraordinary uncertainty, and the primary objective of any public service agreement of a multi-annual nature, because they said the preference on the government side was to do an agreement over a period of years, it needed to be on providing as much certainty for everyone as possible. Now, that doesn't just relate to pay, of course, it relates to many other things, but in relation to pay, we already know, because actually I think the central bank that day or the day before had, come out with its latest projections in relation to inflation, and had kind of caveated it with the fact that, in a severe scenario, sure, inflation next year could go up to 5% or whatever it was. So we said, look, the first thing is we need an approach or a formula to ensure that for the period of an agreement that, things can't get worse, right? That's the first part. Secondly, in relation to this year, we said that, the agreement only covered the first 6 months of this year. There's another 6 months that has to be addressed from a pay point of view. They've pointed to the fact that there were 2 increases this year, one in February and one in June of 1% each. But of course, they've been outstripped by inflation already. And, when we look at, the experience over the last 5 years, so the 3 years of the Building Momentum Agreement and the first 2 years of the agreement that's just expired, so from 2021 to 2025, broadly speaking, the pay of a public servant on average earnings is behind the average rate of inflation, the average annual rate of inflation by about 5%. So we're saying, look, if we're going to deal with this responsibly and sustainably, then, that needs to be addressed over a period of years. We're not prepared to just write it off, nor are we prepared to go back to members and to suggest that we should go into a process that has already kind of left us so far behind inflation as the last two have.
Is that not the nature of doing a deal, though? You do a deal, and if inflation happens to be lower, well, then your members have done particularly well out of it. And if it happens to be higher, well, that's unfortunate, obviously, but it's the nature of doing a deal. You don't know for sure where inflation is going to be. So, should it be the basis that it has to outstrip inflation? Obviously, that's better for your members, but it's quite a good deal to have it guaranteed that wage increases will always be above inflation.
But I think it's generally accepted, aside from the actors in the negotiations, generally accepted that it would be positive from an economic point of view that wages would be ahead of inflation over a period of time. So I think given the experience over the last 5 years, and given the fact that we have pretty much full employment, tight labour market, extraordinary exchequer revenues, if not now, when? The logic of the government position seems to me to be saying, we'll wait till the next financial crisis for workers to get a fair crack at the whip. And that is just not going to wash on this occasion.
And you started this segment of the interview by saying it's a period of such great uncertainty at the moment. It is for workers. It also is for the state, if you extend that logic. Can the government afford, can the taxpayer afford to have, I think on average it was about 4%, it was 10.25 over 2.5 years, the last deal, was it? So 4% per annum, roughly. Can the state afford that again?
Well, of course the state can afford it based on what we see. Can the state afford not to have it is the question I think that needs to be put too, because, workers are rightly looking at, what's happened in government only a few months ago in its response to the fuel protests. They're looking at the decisions that were taken in last year's budget to gift significant taxpayers' money to the hospitality sector in circumstances where, most of the hospitality sector didn't need it. They chose not to index tax bands and allowances. So workers are entitled to expect that their living standards will be protected. In relation to the uncertainty that you describe, I mean, of course, all of us need to be mindful of that. Like inflation itself is, not a friend of workers. Workers always do badly out of, a period where inflation spikes. But I think, if the government want a multi-annual deal, then that gives an ability to all parties to try and address these issues over time, rather than to have a situation where, we have to deal with we have to deal with the problem anyway without an agreement, without an agreed approach.
So what gets a deal done this time? If it was an average of 4% the last time, I think projected private sector wage growth for next year is 4% as well. 4% seems like a pretty consistent number that keeps coming up here. What gets a deal done?
Well, we haven't put a number on it, nor have we said in the exploratory talks, we haven't said, look, we were looking for a number at this stage. It's more a formula, to ensure that, over the period of an agreement, we can't kind of fall further behind inflation, and we have some way of trying to catch up. So it seems to me sensible that you start from trying to bring people together to have some kind of planned approach to that, where we can have a sustainable, reasonable outcome.
Do you have a sense that maybe the government wants to, because there doesn't seem, looking from the outside, to be a huge urgency on the government's behalf here. Do you have a sense that they might want to roll it into budget talks? Because we've had talk of childcare funding increasing, tax cuts coming this year. Do you have a sense that they want to do it all together?
Well, it's very clear that the Taoiseach and the Minister for Public Expenditure are talking up, the budget measures. And of course, we're not against changes in tax bands, that would maintain earnings. In fact, they've brought a lot of the problem in relation to that on themselves by their decisions last year. We're not against that. But whatever they do isn't going to replace the need for wage bargaining, including in the public sector. In fact, we made it clear at the budget last year that the decisions that they had taken and the losses that would mean for workers would have to be made good in wage bargaining.
So, but do you think that might be their approach? Have you had any indication that the government would like to push these talks to September, October time around the budget?
No indication as such. I mean, I have to take people as face value that they want to, that they see the merit of an agreement and the stability that an agreement would bring. Maybe their bargaining or negotiating position is influenced by whatever intentions they have around the budget. But, that isn't going to replace the need for a pay agreement. And if we don't have an agreement, we won't have the provisions in relation to industrial peace. We won't have, or they won't have, cost certainty, because, clearly issues will still need to be progressed and pursued. And in terms of the kind of broader kind of issues, affecting the workplace, things like AI, things like privatization and outsourcing, even remote working, they all become potential battlegrounds.
So at what point does your patience run out here? I mean, the old deal has now expired. We see balloting for potential action. At what point do we see industrial action? At what point does your patience run out?
Well, look, I mean, these things are they're not being rushed, but they're following a kind of a logical course. So I chaired the meeting last Friday afternoon of the Public Services Committee, and that meeting agreed unanimously that we would now proceed by asking the affiliate unions to convene their executives to make arrangements for balloting. So I imagine what's going to happen in vast majority of cases, there'll be a kind of a consultative period for a couple of weeks, balloting period to follow, and then we'll be into looking at kind of serving notice of industrial action after that. So
might be a good time to do it as well. EU presidency, it's all very high profile. I mean, do you feel like the conditions are somewhat in your favour, that surely the government wants an industrial peace at this moment in time.
I would hope so, but I think the EU presidency, that's not a target. This is a longer, and I suppose this is the point. This is kind of potentially a sea change in how things have operated. So if we move away from the kind of idea of multi-annual agreements, we then are back into a situation where maybe we're into fights over annual pay rounds. We're into kind of more traditional trade union organization around all of the issues that come up in the workplace from time to time. And importantly, we're also into a situation where every group, grade and category has its issue and potential aspiration. They become claims. One of the things that the government have got over the last while is a way of managing those through the local bargaining mechanism that existed in the last agreement. And, the vast majority of public servants, or certainly a clear majority of public servants, have seen no benefit of that yet, even though it was due to be paid from the 1st of September last year. That's another frustration that exists on our side of the table.
Did the fuel protests fundamentally change how protest and negotiation will be carried out in this country? I heard you on Morning Ireland a couple of days after the €750 million package, and you sounded certainly aggrieved, maybe angry, that you were making the point, we play by the rules, we have to give proper notice of any action. This grouping or disparate groups didn't do so. Look what they've landed. We won't play by... The sense I got was we won't be playing by the rules any longer if this is how it's done.
Well, I think, look, members of trade unions are asking fair questions, and they're looking on at this and they're seeing that it appears now that he who shouts loudest gets heard. And it's not lost on people. I don't think, public servants as a whole have changed, their approach. All public servants want is a fair deal. They want to know that their standard of living is going to be protected and improved over time. But there's no doubt, the way in which people who abide by the law, even people who practice their industrial relations in accordance with the legal provisions, then looking on to people who block roads and blockade ports getting rewarded, that certainly has had an impact, I think, right across.
Does it require the unions to shout just as loud and to be potentially just as disruptive? There's always a bit of theatre around negotiations, but are you more inclined to perhaps go down the industrial action route in this instance because you saw the success that the fuel protests had?
That's not the motivation now. I see this as kind of very much a longer term situation if that's the way it plays out. If we can't get to an agreement, I think then we're into a different era of industrial relations. That'll present its own challenges for unions, but from the government's point of view, they certainly will not be able to count on industrial peace. Mm-hmm. I think their ability to plan from a budgetary point of view will be difficult. They can plan, but they won't have the certainty that goes with that. And critically, every possible change then becomes a potential flashpoint. Whereas, what, these agreements have given is, it's not that everybody's happy with everything, but there's a structured approach to how things are done. And by and large, I think, over the last 40 years, there's been a lot of positives. That's no longer the situation that we're in. I think the main message I'd like to get across is this is different. And it's the only way that it is going to be retrieved is by government recognizing there is a problem here. People want certainty. Let's come up with a way to build that in relation to pay from the outset. And then, let's see what can be done in talks to pull a broader agreement together. I think that's a reasonable approach for us to take. We're certainly not going to go into a situation where we don't know until the very end of a process what it is that the government have decided to pay. And all the talk that we're hearing about kind of budgetary planning and all the rest of it does nothing at the moment to kind of give us confidence that they understand the issues that our members and the challenges are facing.
Mm-hmm. Just before we finish, I want to touch very briefly on a bigger picture, longer term, the future of work. You wrote a very interesting piece for us a couple of months ago, hooked on a policy paper from OpenAI, which was kind of the thrust of your piece. It was surprising to see some of the policy suggestions that a tech company, rather than perhaps a union, was putting forward. It's stuff like a 4-day week, public wealth funds so that citizens could benefit from AI, taxes on automated labour, really interesting stuff. AI is everywhere and, you know, it's kind of hard to avoid. But in the round, take 20, 30 years, do you think AI will be a positive for workers?
I think that's what's to play for at the moment. And I mean, I see different things almost every day. There's a number of different pieces of research or opinion in relation to AI. So, saw something the other day in relation to the threat to jobs in the Irish economy and the type of jobs that I think the bigger issue really is going to be about how AI affects the quality of the jobs and whether or not, instead of it, bringing about more surveillance and kind of downgrading jobs, how can we, enhance jobs and make them better? So I think potentially AI, can be a benefit, not just for workers, but for citizens in the case of the public service and more broadly. But it requires, that's all the more reason why it requires to be approached in a structured and an agreed way. So we've been looking, obviously, from our point of view about kind of, negotiating red lines around it. By and large, look, I think, there's a lot of consensus. I'm a member of the National Economic and Social Council. We've had a paper in relation to AI. We've seen the Oireachtas Committee and its approach. A lot of that, there's a lot of common case around this, right? But, isn't that all the more reason why we need to have an agreed way of taking it forward? Because if we don't have that, the starting point from a worker's point of view is going to be, hold on a minute here, we don't want anything to happen until we get all the reassurances. And if we have to do that, kind of every case by case, you can see how potentially disruptive it will be and how kind of damaging it might be in terms of our ability to, use AI to positive effect. I think, look, as a country, the challenge for us is to, not just in relation to AI, but AI is a good one. Remote working is another. We should be trying to do these things to the best possible way we can. These are global phenomena, but they have, the potential, if got right in an Irish context, to really help us in terms of society and all the rest of it. Remote working, from the point of view of, regional development, rural regeneration, the, environmental factors like the commuting. Any of us, like I commute, from Newbridge. So, like those of us who are spending kind of lost time in the car every day are very frustrated when you see unnecessary pulls of people back into the office. So these are things that I think make the case for, stronger consensus-based approach. But of course, unless we can get cost of living right, then we're not even at the races. Yeah.
Okay. We could do another 35 or 40 minutes, if not longer, on future work stuff. We'll be hearing a lot more, I think, over the coming weeks and months from you, given the talks that are forthcoming, hopefully. So, Kevin, thanks very much for joining us. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Peter.
You're welcome back. That's not a good place to be in. I think we need to brace ourselves. I think there's fire and fury coming, I think.
Yeah, it doesn't strike me as a good starting point for negotiations. Now, again, as we said, there's always a bit of a dance, there's
Yeah.
a bit of theatre, there's a bit of weird
Saber
unhappy
rattling,
before we
etc.
even start. But I do get the sense, and I mentioned it in the interview, that interview he did with Morning Ireland about 2 or 3 days after getting after the fuel protest package was announced, he sounded like he was seething. And it really
it
felt
just came
like
through the air. It just came through the radio, really, didn't it?
it kind of felt like, I'm a bit sick of this.
Yeah.
If this is how people can get stuff done in this country, we're not going to play nice anymore, was kind of the overarching sentiment I got from it. And he didn't resile from it
No, he
when I
didn't.
asked
No,
him
he
there.
didn't.
So I do think that's the undercurrent and the undertone of it. And then he already talks about just how he feels they've been ignored on certain issues. Like there's enough building already before we even get in the room to suggest that this could be troublesome.
But back to our earlier conversation, at what point does his pragmatism kick in, or at what point are we leaning into maybe a more militant type tendency, you know, in terms of a more active or a more kind of disruptive, i.e. in terms of taking industrial action?
Yeah, and I mean, put it to him, he said that's not the motivation, which you take that at face value and I would accept it. But you also just have to think, again, I do feel like the fuel protest changed perhaps how people
Well, it definitely changed
go
the
about
landscape.
protest.
Yeah.
And if you're a union leader trying to protect the value and importance of being part of a union and doing something in an organised, structured way, it strikes me that you might feel like you have to be a little bit throwing the weight around a small bit more this time than before. There's kind of a new player in town.
Yeah.
It's about how people talk about politics generally and like how the extremes, you know, you have Trump at one end and then suddenly the whole discourse gets pulled to one side, or you have a far left, it all gets pulled that way.
Yeah.
It's kind of like if this is how one group, or as the fuel protests were, all sorts of disparate entities, that's how they get something done. Maybe it kind of pulls everything a little bit that way.
I remember I was doing research. I was one of the times I was sitting down on Path to Power with Matt and John, and I was doing my kind of research for it. And I remember just talking to somebody, he said, like, understood, like, deal had to be done and some package had to be announced. I'd never thought it was going to be 500 million. Like, you might have thought a 10 million, 20 million kind of deal package might get them off the streets. It just seemed that what they put out there seemed to be completely out of whack as to what was sort of being demanded. You know what I mean? And like, the sort of belated sort of desire to kind of clear the streets, you know what I mean? They were sort of happy to let them sit there for 2, 3, 4 days. Like, but I think all it has done is galvanise the more active and probably the more militant members of the union, who probably spoil for a fight every couple of years anyway. They kind of want, you know, to kind of show their teeth and show their force. And that's the test for someone like Kevin Callinan now, as to whether or not he can keep that show, keep them together, keep them united. And I remember, like, when Patricia King was sort of in the role, and even predecessors like Jack O'Connor, you know what I mean, they kind of would talk to you about that balance of trying to, you know, obviously push forward the agenda of trying to get the best deal possible, but then also keeping the team united as well.
You have to know as the leader when to go with what's a good deal, and to tell your membership then, we're falling in line with this, stand down, we don't need to go any further with it. That's the balancing act of being the leader, a union leader.
You raised the issue of AI with them, and I thought his answers were somewhat curious. He didn't necessarily say, oh, we're against it completely and we're kind of...
Yeah, so interesting, like, again, I referenced that piece that he wrote for us a couple of months ago. You could, like, the tone of his piece was surprised that these 4-day working week and tax the robots and stuff were in Sam Altman's policy. He was like, this could be a union manifesto. And in that piece, he says 2 things. Number 1, these are all really worthy of discussion. Number 2, we should be wary of who is saying them.
Yeah.
Which I think is probably fair. Like, I think the pressure, the rush for unions now, and for government and for policymakers, is you get the guardrails around AI now, because if you get it right, then those benefits should flow for society, for workers, for everybody. If you don't get the guardrails right, this is going to march on anyway. And who knows what the labour market is going to look like. And
we see that with Microsoft this week in terms of the potential impact of all of this. Like,
So I think, like, in some ways, he was kind of encouraged by the fact that a company like OpenAI were putting these things that unions would be asking for ordinarily on the table. But I think he's right in that, like, the task now is, if you want to see the benefits in 5, 10, 15, 20 years for workers and for society more broadly, it's kind of now that we need to be getting the policy formation right.
Absolutely. Well, our thanks to Kevin Callinan for being our guest this week. And I do, in fairness, like, he could have taken the approach of saying, I'm not talking to the Business Post or whatever. I thought it was great that he's written for us, and I think it's great that he came out, because I think it's fascinating. I think what I like about these podcasts is that we're getting a real insight into how these kind of leaders are thinking and kind of get inside their heads.
But even on that, just very briefly, you hear him mention the forums the fora he's part of with the IBEX of the world. I think there's actually a lot of common ground that both the business lobby and the unions have on a lot of issues. So it's with the government he doesn't have much common ground with at the moment.
And that's a space we will certainly be watching, and you can follow all of our coverage in the Business Post and businesspost.ie in the weeks ahead. But for me, for the moment, Danny McConnell.
And me, Peter O'Dwyer.
I think I masked that up, but we'll keep going. But anyway, you get the message. Join us next week for the latest edition of the Business Post podcast. Until then, thanks very much, and bye-bye for now.